Hello, hello. Welcome to the stream. And yeah, I don't have all the details on it, but I heard the release of Leviathan did not go all that well for them. But we're gonna hopefully this England run will go better for us than the DLC release went for Paradox. Oh Lord, I haven't even really looked too much at what it changed. I saw a couple EU4 YouTubers talking about it. Oof. Their DLCs just have been very hit or miss lately. That is bad. But yeah, no, it's Emperor was good. Rights of Man was good. But yeah, it's been pretty hit or miss. And I am keeping it dark in here because it is ungodly hot in Baltimore and it is super sticky. But that's the Mid-Atlantic for you. What's up? Dixieland. I can show you. Dixieland is a phrase for the American South, which the states that are in it really vary depending on who you ask. Um, so, so yeah, that's what the Southerners called the South, and the official cutoff was the Mason-Dixon line, which is the northern border of Maryland. Also, yeah, there are so many bangers written during the Civil War. So I am technically in the South. So I am yeah, but Dixieland, if you want to go on the definition that was around during the Civil War, would have been Mason-Dixon line south. So roughly this. These days, it's as somebody in Maryland in the modern United States, it's basically Virginia, Kentucky, Arkansas, South, may or may not be including Texas, depending on who you ask. It's way less of a geographical distinction and much more of a cultural one. One second. And I will tell you, if you want the best barbecue, you go to Dixieland. Mm-hmm. Sure thing. And that's the thing that a lot of people don't really get about the United States is New York and LA are like the main cultural hubs as far as most of the rest of the world is concerned. At least from my experiences traveling. Uh, I understand that it's a bit of a stereotype, but let me tell you, my family, we go down to North Carolina every summer, and oh my God, if you ever have the opportunity, get plucked pig. It is wonderful. Maryland's interesting because we kind of live in like a transitory area between North and South. Like if you're in Baltimore or Annapolis, you might as well be in the North. But if you're in Western Maryland, you're basically in West Virginia, and if you're in Eastern Maryland, you're basically in the South. Oh, that looks tasty. That looks very tasty. I'm gonna have to get my hands on some of that. Oh, I am rolling in money. When did that happen? Not much I can really build with it just yet. At least it's worth building. Very nice. Yeah, no, Maryland's good because we're a decent drive from like New York high restaurants and Southern barbecue. Also, similar thing is actually going on here at the moment. Food prices have been inflating like nobody's business, and gas prices are starting to go up too. But it's my understanding that that's happening in a lot of places. I mean, I can tell you, as somebody who watches the markets all day as part of his job, wait, is what is going on here? Okay, that makes more sense. Yeah, no, the markets are not. I'll just say the rest of this year will be very interesting to see. Yeah, no. Spending trillions of dollars sounds like a great idea, but when you are up to your neck in debt, uh, it can have a lot of negative side effects. Like a little bit of inflation is a natural thing that you see in economies, and it's not really a problem if it's managed well. But when prices start running up very quickly, that is a sign you are having the bad kind of inflation. Like, it's never good, but under a lot of conditions, it's ooh, that is some really crazy inflation. I do understand that you guys have an interesting currency system down there that you use both US dollars and pesos. Also, France is getting nuked. Holy shit. That's fine with me. Keeps them out of my hair. I will take the innovativeness and prestige. Yeah, let's sell church positions. That never hurt anybody before. I gotcha. Huh. I am familiar with Mexican pesos. They're actually not. Some of them still include some silver, which makes them objectively more valuable than American coins, which haven't included precious metals for decades, since the 70s at least, I think. Trust me, I have many rants I could go on about government fiat currencies, but I'll spare you those. That actually is it's close to happening with the pennies in America. Actually, I think it already has happened. I think they cost 2 cents to make, and that's the 1 cent coin. Also, oh yes. All right, as soon as that truce is over, which will be next year, we can get a union with Scotland. And France should still be in a horrible position and completely incapable of helping even if they got the alliance back on track. And actually, that alliance is what kept Scotland independent, at least a large part of it, for as long as it was. The old alliance between Scotland and France. Um, Largely an alliance of geographical convenience because it just made sense for these two countries, neither of which liked England to gang up on it, basically. Well, it's cheaper in the long run because Diplo power is, I think, the least valuable of all of the mana up here. The Diplo idea groups aren't typically as good as the military and admin ideas, and there's not as much you can do with Diplo points. But admin, military, I want to preserve as much of those as I can. So if I can just peacefully absorb these countries, then taking all of Ireland like this has not cost me a single admin point. That is true, but as England, I'm playing tall, so that's true. But if I typically play the smaller countries. So if you're playing a smaller country, then Diplo is much better spent annexing vassals and the like. And they got the alliance back. But France might still be. Okay, France is still weak. So if we go now, we can actually call Portugal. Alright, I'm taking my chance now before the French get strong enough to intervene. Manpower is non existent. That is true, but from where I'm standing, I can see the Chinese making a serious push for the yuan becoming the new global currency. It won't happen unless something really catastrophic happens in the US, but I can tell you there are other countries that want to replace the dollar. And if any of you are familiar with the problem of the Thucydides trap, the world is walking right into it again. where you have a rising global power interacting with a declining global power. And every time it's happened historically, the results have been completely disastrous for everybody involved. The most recent examples were the World Wars. That was the rising power Germany meeting the established power Britain. Yeah, they're honestly, as far as I'm concerned, the U.S. doesn't have geopolitically much to bring it into conflict with Iran, for example. But Iran is one of the few countries that isn't party to a lot of the same global financial instruments that every other country is involved in. So they kind of make a natural enemy that way, even though realistically, what interest does the U.S. truly have in Iran? And I don't really see much of one. I honestly think the vast majority of the US's problems stem from the fact that we have completely ignored. Also, yeah, that would be a total shit show, but it didn't stop us from invading Afghanistan, which also proved to be a complete fucking mess. I mean, it didn't earn the nickname the Graveyard of Empires for nothing. Actually, Afghanistan might be even more mountainous than Iran, which is really bad for us. But the various groups that the US has been fighting in Afghanistan aren't nearly as organized as the Iranian military would be. So, to get an idea of what Iran would look like, think of what would happen if the Taliban had access to the resources and organization of a modern state military. It would be disastrous. But the U.S. hasn't been making good decisions for a while. Ever since we started ignoring George Washington's farewell address warning against foreign entanglements, and decided that fucking around with the rest of the world was a great idea. Turns out when you do that, a lot of people don't like it very much. And it tends not to go very well for you. Apparently, we didn't learn from the mistakes of the European empires that messing around with other people's homelands doesn't generally shake out very well for the person messing around with other people's homelands. We can probably take this now. There we go. And we have the Union. We have the Union, and we're about to integrate Ireland. And we are definitely going to want to devote a diplomat to that as soon as possible. Move these guys back down here. And you guys can go there. And we will. Where's the loyalist option? There we go. Support loyalists. Keep things under control. And in 1485, we have basically united The British Isles. Let's build up our trade fleets. Yeah, I am a victim of obsessive compulsive disorder. So sometimes like before this started, I went in and I fixed Russia because the borders were just disgusting to look at. But this is going to look real nice until Ireland's fully integrated. Yeah. I don't even know if I can do that, especially because it looks like the Czechs have started eating Austria. I kind of want to see where that goes. Could be fun to see a Bohemia do something interesting. Granted, they're one of those countries where, yeah, no, they're one of those countries where either they do nothing at all and they get absorbed by somebody, or they wind up controlling all of Central Europe. Yeah, let's stop that flu. Yeah, that's. Oh, that's Theodosia, not the Genoese. But actually, I have an interesting thing to talk about there. The HRE is disgusting to look at. Um, and I can tell you historically, a lot of people hated dealing with it too. But interesting thing about the Crimea. So the OPM of Theodoro, it's Gothic. Also, yeah, fighting Austria is a pain in the ass. But the Goths were a group of Germanic people that originated in what is now southern Sweden. They moved down to what is now modern Poland, and then they migrated all the way down to the Crimea, where they stayed until the 18th century when their language died out. And they were one of the last remnants of the age of migration. And they were one of the only speakers of East Germanic, which is now a completely extinct language family. And we are still ahead on admin, so we can take the next expansion. All right, and for now I'm going to put him here, but eventually he's going to end up in the New World. Need to. Oh, they must have added that you can't get World Port unless you have 30 development. That's kind of bullshit. Ah, how did they fuck that up? Navy is one of like the background things in this game. Like, no, very few people actually focus on it, and they that is spectacular. Makes me remember Cyberpunk 2077. I think I was one of the only people where that game actually ran on my PS4. But even then, I had pretty frequent crashes. The story was alright, it was just. They fucked up all the basic stuff. Also, if that's. Considering that Cyberpunk is basically the bellwether for gaming fuck up, that is something special. That is something. I I would feel bad, but that's just incompetence right there. Right, so we got to develop London up, which shouldn't be that much of a problem. It's a very valuable city, but I'm actually going to. Yeah, that got mentioned when I booted up the game today. But this save seems to be working all right. Well, I guess now's the time to do a Spain game. But actually, that is a slave trade that continued for a lot longer than most people think it did. Um, the slave trade in the Islamic world continued into the 20th century, and the Barbary pirates were a big part of that until North Africa was completely conquered by Europeans. We can become defender of the faith. Is it worth it? I don't really think so. I kind of want to avoid continental entanglements and just kind of pull a Brexit a few centuries early. Also, that is also true. Hmm. Yeah, listen to the Pope, you filthy heathens. All right, and we have integrated this one. All right, Ireland is nice and integrated. So delete those guys. Delete your transports. I will take your trade ships. And we're not going Anglican this time around because Anglicanism is mechanically so weak. Catholicism is much better from just a mechanic standpoint. It's no orthodoxy, but it's there. Speaking of, I will levy that church tax, get some extra money, and I'll take the justices of the peace. Need more seats in parliament. Let's start early and give the Irish a seat in parliament. That is actually huh. Well, actually, that Old Ironsides is a marvel of 18th century shipbuilding. And actually, her sister ship is in Baltimore, the Constellation. Although it's a rebuilt, the original Constellation was destroyed. But wait, okay, I thought that said Spanish noble rebels, and I was very confused. Though from what you guys have been saying, that wouldn't be too out of Wouldn't be too out of line for what this last update has done. That would be cool if a guy posted a documentary in the chat a while back about an ancient Suez Canal. Like the Suez Canal as it is today did exist in the ancient world. Oh, that's okay. That was you. I am not good at names, so I apologize. Yeah, let's venerate Mary. There we go. No, I have. There are people who I have met like 5 or 6 times who I still blank on their name when I see them. But that was a really interesting documentary. I had no idea they had the technology for that back then. But actually, returning to the Goths for a moment, you will get to hear all about them in the next episode of the podcast, which I am currently in the process of cutting together the video on, and I'm shooting to release it on the 4th or the 5th. It's going to be a good one, I think. Focusing on Germania and Persia during the 3rd century while Rome was kind of shit in the bed. And then it kind of wraps up by talking about Diocletian and his reforms to the Roman government. And I'll take that settler increase. Don't think I have the range. Also, where did. Okay, my explorer must have died. Yeah, no, I don't have the range to. Also, why am I just discovering random. I haven't explored any of this. What the hell? I haven't asked for the maps for any of this. Might be a bug. Oh, and my general died. But we have another one. And I'll take that cottage industry. And I should be able to see some more land. There we go. And actually, even today, the British royal family are the number one landholders in the United Kingdom. Okay, we gotta wait until 1500 anyway, but we also gotta get our tech up, I think. Or wait, is that something? What's going on? Oh, so they eliminated the tech requirement for forming Great Britain. Just needs to be past 1500. That's interesting. I actually don't mind that change at all. That'll make playing England games easier. That is very, very English. I don't care if I abandon that claim because I'm gonna integrate them into my country anyway. Oh, no worries. Yeah, that is one thing. I have never been particularly good at languages. Just not a gift that I have. I can never wrap my head around grammar. It took 3 years of French in high school, and even in the third year, I was saying the right words and my pronunciation was good, but they were all in the wrong order. Okay, what reform do we want? Huh, that is fascinating. As my historical knowledge tends to decline the more modern we get, I am much better at the older stuff than the more recent stuff. So I don't know as much as I would like about the Suez, but I do have an interesting story about ships turning the lights out. So during the Russo-Japanese War, the if you ever think you've fucked up at your job, don't worry, because the admirals of the Baltic Fleet did it worse. At the Battle of Tsushima, they forgot to turn the deck lights of their ships off, so the Japanese Navy was able to fire at them in the dark, and they completely obliterated the entire Russian Baltic Fleet. All because a few guys forgot to turn the lights out. That said, the Russian Navy has never really been anything to write home about. They've always been much more of a land power, which makes sense, but they were a major power. Just one that lacked the sort of naval capabilities you saw with an England or France or a US. Honestly, that's another plus of studying history is you learn about people who yeah, no, the Russian Navy was not particularly good at their jobs during the Russo-Japanese War. And I mean the Russian army didn't do that well either. Just continuing to rely on human wave tactics. Just granted, the Soviets wound up doing the same thing in World War II, and it worked out for them more or less. Also, I should build some cannons. And all of a sudden, this big fucking Russian warship starts shooting at you. I don't think Bad Day really cuts it there. Granted, attacks on fishermen are actually a large part of why you see Somali pirates. I read a very good book on it years ago on like explaining the issue with like what was causing piracy off the coast of Somalia. and there are myriad causes for it, but one of the main reasons the pirates have no issue um, recruiting people is because the fishing industry, which is what Somalia largely relied on. That sounds very American, but so the Chinese actually have moved a lot of fishing vessels off the coast of Somalia and have just started hoovering up all the fish they can get. Completely destroyed the industry and forced a lot of guys into crime to feed their families. Doesn't help that Somalia was already falling apart when this happened. That is crazy. Like, did the government sell those, or did they just barge in and take them? Also, yeah, that was a hefty chunk of change back then. I gotcha. That is a problem with how expensive modern navies are. Is only like major global superpowers can actually afford sizable navies these days. That's got to be a bummer to watch. I mean, I can sympathize. In Maryland, a lot of our eastern coast's economy is reliant on fishing in both the Atlantic and the Chesapeake Bay. So I know how many people globally rely on fishing to pay the bills. But I guess China has already poisoned all of its own waters, so it has to go steal fish from other people. I will say it's a cool thing about living in Maryland is we have the U.S. Naval Academy right there, and if you go down to Annapolis, which is state capital and where the Naval Academy is based, you can occasionally see warships coming into port. It's really cool. That's just disgusting. And I bet the Chinese loved that. Where is our mission? I know we just completed. There we go. Naval power. Yeah, I don't really care what the French think about us. Yeah, that is a personal pet peeve of mine as someone who has studied. Part of learning history is you kind of learn a little bit of other fields like global diplomacy and global politics, and those guys are just dicks. You know the air quality coming out of Beijing is so bad that it's actually poisoning the air of South Korea. Like it has actually adversely affected air quality in an entire country, an entire bay away from China. Um, Air quality, no. But every once in a while, our Navy will have a dust up with China in the South China Sea. China gets acid rain for factories from everybody. I can't think of one major global economy that doesn't do a fair amount of its manufacturing in China, except for China, which, ironically enough, is starting to outsource manufacturing to India and Southeast Asia. Globalism is a bitch. I'm just going to come out right there and say it. It's when nobody's manufacturing their own stuff, it leads to this NIMBYism. Also, yeah, where people don't care how bad the pollution is as long as it's happening, over there. And that holds true no matter where you go. People just don't care. They should, but it's almost all of the plastic in the world's oceans flows into the river, flows into the ocean from Chinese rivers. All right, I'll cede that to Scotland just because I'm getting close to being able to absorb them, and it's not going to happen slowly. It'll happen rather quickly. And let's go back to rivaling France, whose army has gotten smaller. Also, yeah, the argument that because the GDP is growing, things are getting better is complete and utter bullshit. It means things are getting better for a narrow slice of the population, and that's about it. I mean, maybe one day, one time in the past that was true, but these days, with how automated everything is, most of the people on the middle and bottom don't see any of that. Oh well, thank you for turning out for the stream. See you later. Thank you. Good night to you too, man. Yes, it was, and it is. You can actually still go see it. It's in Boston, and I believe it's still commissioned. I think there is still an officer, like a U.S. naval officer, that sits on it. I know they used it for training up until World War II. But yeah, it kind of occupied this weird gray area between frigates and larger warships. Actually, almost like what the Bismarck and the other pocket battleships were for the Germans. It can outshoot anything it can't outrun, and it can outrun anything it can't outshoot. Howdy, welcome to the stream. I'm doing an England run. Should be able to start colonizing soon. But yeah, I'm just talking history and playing EU4, so pretty much I'm basically doing an early Brexit. I'm just trying to abandon Europe to its fate and focus on my own thing. I will definitely check that out. I know a little bit about it, but not as much as I probably should. I know phases of American history fairly well, but I am not. There are some major blank spots. Yeah, let's screw over the Danes. Should be soon. I think I have the range, but I just sent a guy, but he died, so I'm gonna have to send another explorer. Yes, soon I ought to be able to. I also have on a mod that forces historical colonization. I am going to be trying to do this more or less historically. Going to try to do a bit better than the English did in this period. So that means maybe taking over a bit more of India, taking a bit more of Africa. And yeah, I was actually thinking of doing that if I can. Actually, that's some interesting history for me. I live on the East Coast, so we learn all about it in school. And I have been to Williamsburg, which is right near where the first British colonies were. Okay, we lost the cores from France. Oh well. Um, uh, so John Smith was an interesting guy. He was he was kind of somewhere between a pirate and a legitimate guy. Like he wasn't he wasn't the terror of the seven seas, but he also didn't object to a little bit of looting at gunpoint. Yeah, I think you might have been legally classified as a privateer. Basically, the British sent him because he was a guy who could get stuff done. Oh boy, that would have been a nightmare if that had actually gone and happened. But no, the British sent John Smith because he was a guy who was known to be able to get shit done. But most of his men hated him. They actually gagged him and tied him to the main mast of the ship because they got sick of him. like on his first voyage into America. Though there was a slightly earlier failed colony in Roanoke, North Carolina, and I have gone to go visit the. There's a town there today. It's rather cool, actually. And there's also another weird little island out there called Ocracoke, where they actually have a completely unique dialect of American English. And there's actually a very small British military cemetery there. Because the British set up a listening post during the Battle of the Atlantic on Ocracoke. Alright, looks like I am going to have to go to war with Portugal because they have Bermuda and I want Bermuda. I don't think I have to worry too much about the French, but actually I can grab them as an ally right now. Wait, are they allied? Alright, I am going to dissolve that alliance. I might have to go to war with Castile because they are allied with the Portuguese. So my main ally right now is Sweden because I helped them get their independence. Oh yeah, sorry. True. So I don't think I'm gonna get the Spanish because they are a rival of mine. Or sorry, the French. Brittany. What's Provence doing? Okay, that's interesting. Provence got Milan as a vassal, or as a junior partner. So that, or sorry, Naples, which okay, less impressive. Yeah, England did not have many friends in this period. Which, I mean, it's real easy to get by with no allies when you can just kind of sit on your island and be impossible to invade. She's not a good enough heir. If she was better, I would take the negatives and just go with it, but she's not. What's what is? I thought that was Poland for a second, and I was wondering how in hell that actually happened. I will take that Diplo power. There we go. And I can probably gonna start developing because they added that feature in that you can't upgrade your centers of trade unless you develop them a bit more. Also, somehow I think the Western European borders are going to be disgusting because the Castilians have been able to get a foothold in France, and they still don't control all of Iberia yet. These are going to be some gross borders. That isn't. That sounds like a wild game. Yeah, no, the Pyrenees are just such a nice natural border. They just need to they just need to stick to them. But this is going to be disgusting because France is going or Spain is going to absorb some of Gascony. I'm going to have to fix these borders next time, aren't I? Hey, on the bright side, we are getting closer to forming Great Britain. Need to get our legitimacy up. Oh yeah, we've already got that. Ugh, it's disgusting. Like I will say, as somebody who is not from Europe in the slightest, I think the German Empire had some of the most aesthetic borders ever in European history. Like for whatever reason, it's just very aesthetically pleasing to look at a map of the German Empire. Um, they have a couple that are related to that. I can't think of them off the very top of my head, but I am playing this one right up to 1821, so we should get to see them. And I also have a mod on that forces colonization to be historical. I do know you. There's an event. I think we might have missed it, but there's an event. Oh, we got colonization. That's awesome. Always love it when you grab those. I am not eager to see what this turns into. Somehow I think this is going to be a gross looking Western Europe. Like I'm no stranger to border gore. I'm also a big fan of Crusader Kings, but some things push even me to my limits. They did, and that's actually it was perceived that North America was not particularly valuable. It was actually a little bit more than 100 years after Spain. So the first British colonies in North America show up in 1607, and that was Jamestown. And then you get Plymouth Rock in 1621. And actually, common misconception about the Plymouth Rock colony and the first Thanksgiving. So the English got along very well with one local native tribe. That native tribe had other tribes that it really did not like, even a little bit. So, after teaching the English how to survive in North America, they hired them as mercenaries to help them eradicate the other native tribe. There are a few mods that do that. Um, But so after destroying this rival tribe, they celebrated the first Thanksgiving using that tribe's stores that they had captured. That would be wild, but I don't think CK3 goes far enough ahead time wise for that to really work. Just need a bit more. Oh, I need a lot more colonial range. Honestly, colonial range is one of the goofiest mechanics. Alright, Age of Reformation. Need to get my legitimacy up. And there we go. Take those awesome British ideas. And we have united the British Isles much earlier than they were done historically. And we can state Scotland, get some extra money going. But actually, I mentioned this last time with my flag mod. So this is the Union Jack without St. Patrick's Cross from Northern Ireland. But you can see the red cross is the cross of St. George, and the white border around it is the white field of the English flag. Then you have the white cross of St. Andrew on a blue field for Scotland, and the modern Union Jack splits the white cross of St. Andrew with the red cross of St. Patrick for Northern Ireland. Because for a long time in English history, Ireland was held as a separate kingdom. It was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, not the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. So Ireland was a separate kingdom, technically speaking, under the rule of the British Crown. So it was largely in terms of how they handled it differently. So part of the reason for why the Spaniards colonized as rapidly as they did is a lot of what they did conquer was land that was already under the control of major empires, like the Aztec and the Inca and the like. So they were able to largely co opt a lot of the imperial structures that were already there, which made the conquest go by much faster. Because they were just able to integrate existing methods into their own administration. Whereas where the British and the French colonized, there were no large empires or states for them to integrate and co-opt the structures of. But the Spaniards did kind of pay for being the first out of the gate, and really so did the Portuguese, largely due to how their economies worked. So what the Spanish Empire was the first like modern empire without modern economic structures underpinning it. So it kind of was operating on a semi-medieval economy, and that's part of why the mass importation of silver is what did them in. Because they were just able to extract money out of the ground. They didn't really have to bother developing the land. Whereas in Canada, for the French, the main resource they were after were furs. You had to actually go into the woods and get them. And the British had to go the really slow route. Also true, but that's again, that's part of what the British were doing colonization wise. So the French weren't really in too much conflict with the natives because they weren't engaging in any real large scale agriculture. British colonies, in order to turn a profit, had to grow things like cotton and tobacco and other cash crops, and that required a lot of land. And that's a large part of what brought them in conflict with the Native Americans. Whereas in Quebec and New France, most of what the French were after were things that the natives already hunted, and there was plenty of it, so there was no real competition. That the French were better at integrating other people into their culture was another thing entirely, but it did help them later, especially with their colonization in Africa and Southeast Asia. That's actually also indirectly a large part of why a lot of people of French Canadian descent have a fair amount of Native American descent as well. So, because of what the French were doing in the Americas, it was almost entirely men going over. So, there was a distinct shortage of women in French colonies. So, this prompted the French king to get together a group of women called Le Filles du Roi, or the Daughters of the King, and he sent them over, but that still wasn't enough. So it was much easier for a lot of French men living in these colonies to just marry local women. And so a lot of French Canadians today have a fair amount of Native American admixture because of that intermarriage between those early French colonists and the local tribes. I mean, yours truly, I have some of that. My grandmother looks very much, at least in part, Native American. And things like that are very interesting to me, just the different styles these countries took as they. Oh, that is disgusting to look at. I hate everything about that. Also, yeah, the England and the US have a very special relationship for a lot of reasons, but that is one of them. And you can honestly sort of like how Russia was more or less the successor to the Mongol Empire, the U.S. has kind of been the successor to the British Empire. I mean, you can kind of see them parallel each other. Russia is the elephant to America's whale. The real hard power of the U.S. military is its navy, and that's how it always has been. And I mean, America is first and foremost a naval power. And I mean, geographically, it makes a lot of sense. Friendly countries, at least relatively friendly, to the north and south, and then nothing but ocean for thousands of miles to the east and west. Loads of natural harbors on either coast. That yeah, that is I hate that. Ugh. France is not looking too well. Also, yeah, that is exactly what I'm talking about. It's the elephant versus the whale. It's sort of like what happened with England and France during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon could never beat the British at sea, whereas the British struggled to fight Napoleon on land. And also, I gotta tell you, I because I live relatively close to it. I've been down to Norfolk, Virginia, which is the main base of the U.S. Navy on the eastern coast. And if you're as you're driving in, you can just see miles of military docks where they have like I've seen destroyers docked there. Never seen an aircraft carrier in person, although that would be really cool. A while back, they brought the new pride and joy of the U.S. Navy, the USS Zumwalt, to Baltimore, which is a stealth destroyer. Really cool looking ship. Looks like it's from the future. Granted, it kind of is. I believe it's the newest ship in the fleet. Let me see if I can find you a picture of that one. It's from the future, and it has weapons from the future too. It's got a yeah, it's got a rail gun. It is a really cool looking ship. But they brought this to Baltimore a while back, and it is like the next generation of destroyer craft. USS Abraham Lincoln versus the Lighthouse. I think I have. Oh yeah, I've read this one online before. That's funny. There's a great one from World War One that has a similar punchline where it's a British sentry watching watching over the trenches, and there's a Frenchman and a Russian who both like acquiesce to his orders to find out who he is. They were certainly good, but the elite troop of the century of the 19th century, I would say it would probably have been Napoleon's Old Guard. In the early 19th century, and then it gets to be kind of a toss up in the later 19th century. There's an argument to be made for the Prussians. Oh, we have an heir. He kind of sucks, but he's an heir. So that's good enough. That said, the song British Grenadiers is a total banger. There, we should be able to upgrade this once we have 800 gold. And I'm also going to start developing Lincolnshire. There we go. Start expanding my trade power in the English Channel. These are all at least level 2. So next thing to do is get London to level 3. That's also largely because the US didn't have many grenadier units. And in order to face a grenadier unit effectively, your men had to have unshakable discipline and morale. And the US Army had high morale, but they had nowhere near the discipline of the British military. So, grenadiers were very effective at breaking undisciplined troops. The US's largest strength is the average. Well, the US's greatest strength then is very comparable to its greatest strength now. Pretty much everybody's packing, and they know the land very well. That said, Washington, I think, is one of the most underrated generals of the 18th century. Considering that he turned really an underdeveloped colonial nation into a country capable of actually fighting one of the great powers of Europe is impressive. If you ever get the chance, go to Mount Vernon. It's worth it. It was Washington's home, and the man had taste, I will say that much. The place is beautiful. And if you're a fan of whiskey like me, they have a distillery on site that makes whiskey that's supposed to be similar to what Washington would have made when he lived there. But no, there's a whole museum dedicated to George Washington's life, and then you can go see the house itself, which is it overlooks the Potomac River, and it is gorgeous. So yeah, the man had taste, definitely. Poland has decided to rival me for some reason. So the biggest battles, I mean, you have like Yorktown and the crossing of the Delaware, but I would say the biggest battle Washington had was on the home front because, and this is a common misconception, a lot of people in the Americas were loyalists to the British military or to the British crown. So part of what made Washington so effective is that he was an incredibly charismatic commander, and he was able to sway a lot of people over to the colonial cause. And he also gave them a figure to rally around. Because if you look at the figures around Washington, like your Jefferson and your Hamilton, Adams, and the like, they were all fighting with each other a lot. Washington presented a unified front against the British. Ms. White, to this day, he's one of the only presidents who was elected unanimously. Actually, he was the only president who was ever elected unanimously. Um, not just once, but twice. Really, he does not get enough credit for what he actually accomplished. Because people think of the U.S. now, and they think of Britain now, and they're like, oh, it would have been just a curb stomp, but not even close. The U.S. was by a long shot the underdog in that conflict. And the other thing to his credit that he knew how to use what the U.S. had for everything it was worth. Also, yeah, that the War of 1812 is a whole nother shit show that I actually have a pretty good personal connection to because a good chunk of it was fought in Maryland, and the national anthem was written based on one of the battles that happened. George III, who was not so much bad as he was a complete lunatic. Like, and bad in the moral sense. He was a very bad king, but he was also insane. And that was a large part of why the US Revolution happened. Because he was insane and incompetent. But that's the crapshoot of monarchy for you. Sometimes you get a really good one, sometimes you get a really shitty one, but you can't really tell which will be which until it's too late. First amphibious. Yeah, there were a lot of loyalists, as I mentioned, and if there was a king who would give the colonials like a seat in parliament or something and eased up on taxes, then you might have seen that. But he didn't because he was a lunatic. Also, first amphibious war. I honestly don't know about that. Um, I know it wasn't the Mexican American War that we. The only war we had to navally invade someone at that point was Cuba, but we didn't really pull like a D-Day invasion. There wasn't really much of a contested landing, mostly because the U.S. had complete overwhelming naval supremacy over Cuba and Spain. And then the Mexican American War was fought entirely on land because Mexico had no real navy to speak of. Let's say if you're thinking in terms of amphibious invasions in the modern era, the first one would have been Gallipoli. But Gallipoli was a complete and utter disaster. It actually almost cost Winston Churchill his career. And it's part of why the Allies were so nervous to actually do D Day. Because the only other analog to it that had been tried met with complete and utter failure. And when I say complete and utter failure, I mean complete and utter failure. They didn't even get past the beachhead, really. And so many Australian, New Zealander, Indian, and Irish lives were waste. Yeah, no, that is true. He almost got kicked out of the country. But so many and the reason they used them is because the British thought the Australians, New Zealanders, Irish, and Indians were expendable. And this actually is part of what leads to Australia and New Zealand developing their own senses of nationhood, and one of the final straws for the Irish, because a lot of the leaders of the Irish uprising were in Gallipoli. Like Parnell and a handful of others were fought at Gallipoli. And a lot of Indians got thrown into the meat grinder there as well, which also fueled the already existing Indian separatist movements in that country. World War One is what broke the British Empire. World War Two just finished the job. Because the British Empire was already starting to fall apart going into World War Two. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were already pushing for greater degrees of autonomy from the Crown, and you already had a strong Indian separatist movement going on. So it was going to happen eventually. World War II just sped the process up by costing the British what military assets they had left. And even though the British Empire reached its territorial peak in the interwar period, the height of the British Empire would have been like the 1880s and 1890s in terms of its power and prestige, because it was all downhill for them after that, really. Yeah, it's so interesting how Winston Churchill was one of those guys who could always manage to come back from something. Because he had numerous disastrous decisions he made that should have ended his career, but somehow he kept coming back, and you got to give the guy credit for that. He thought he was the best man for the job, and he wouldn't listen to anybody who told him he wasn't. So you almost got to appreciate that level of stubbornness. And there we go. Tech level 9. And I should be able to start building out my road network now. Also, this is another great mod to tool around with. Great for role playing. It allows you to build a road network in your country. Oh, France is going to look disgusting. The Burgundians are getting in there now. Right, so Germany was kind of its own worst enemy in World War One. Had they fought France the hard way, the British might not have gotten involved. Like, were it not for the Schlieffen Plan, Britain probably would have stayed out of World War One. But the British might still have gotten involved in some way because they had other motives for fighting Germany. Yeah. And honestly, the main reason Britain allied with France and wanted to fight Germany is because the German Navy threatened them. So, the odds of the Germans building a navy that would actually beat the British for size was slim. But the thing you need to consider is the British had a global empire. Also, yes. So, the British Navy was spread out all across their empire. And the Germans were very close to achieving local superiority to the British, at sea at least. And the Kriegsmarine was nothing you would want to laugh at. They were a very effective fleet. The British were also threatened by Italy because the Italians threatened their local superiority over the Mediterranean fleet. But you're right, I don't think the Germans would have stopped at France. Honestly, the Kaiserreich mod for Hearts of Iron 4 more realistic than a lot of what if Germany had won scenarios. The other big wild card is the US, and the US was actually torn because a lot of people in the US wanted to get in on Germany's side, particularly the large German and Irish immigrant communities. The Germans still felt a degree of loyalty to the motherland, and the Irish Americans were on board for anything that would fuck over the English. Realistically, though, if the British had just stayed out of World War One, they probably would have been able to hang on to the empire for a lot longer than they did. I mean, Germany's largest problem in both world wars is it has one hell of an industrial base, but no real access to fuel. That is also an incredible story, and it's always interesting to read what the Europeans were trying to do during the American Civil War. Um, the thing is, the British weren't going to openly support the Confederacy because the British had already abolished slavery, and that would have been a pretty bad look if your country had just abolished slavery, but you were fighting on behalf of a country that was fighting to preserve it. And the British were easily able to make up for the loss in cotton with India. The South greatly overestimated its importance to the British textile industry. And this is also true. I don't. England was not an original member of the Entente powers, which why you would go to war over Belgium is beyond me. But that is true. The main thing that got England involved in the war is Belgium, which ironically Belgium was created by the English to stop the French from getting too powerful in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. But yeah, it's I would say the two most interesting alternate history questions for me in World War One are what if the British never got involved, and what if the Italians actually sided with the Germans, which they almost did, but then decided not to because the Italians have this thing where they change sides. That would have been fun if they have it. Also, yeah, no, the Schlieffen plan. The Schlieffen plan was a good plan for the wrong war because we saw that it worked very well in World War II. But the problem was it would have required a much more mobile army than anyone had access to in World War One. And yeah, the Germans also had counted on the Italians being involved on their side. Granted, given how the Italians performed in World War One, I don't know whether that would have been a help or a hindrance to the Germans. Considering the fact that the Germans were already basically carrying Austria-Hungary to the finish line. They must be doing something big then. If it's Victoria 3, I'm going to be very excited. That is such a fun period in history to cover. So, the main issue with the French was how they were defending. So, the Maginot Line was a good idea in theory. The problem really was that the Belgians didn't finish their half of it. And two, where French units met Germans in battle, they performed very well, but they were poorly led. And their tanks were mechanically very good. They just weren't using them in a very smart way. French tanks were largely used to support the infantry, whereas the Germans used the tanks to operate largely autonomously, to punch a hole and go through it. So even though the French tanks were better one on one, they were never fighting one on one with German tanks. They were usually fighting several German tanks at once, which the German tanks overwhelmed them with local superiority. And then once there was a hole in the defenses, the rest of the German army could go through. And it wasn't really down to the technology. It was how they were using it. And actually, Charles de Gaulle was one of the few generals who thought the way they were using the tanks was bad, but nobody listened to him because he was considered too young. There was still an old guard hanging around from World War One that had very set in their ways ideas for how a modern army was supposed to operate. Um, and not really. So in a one-on-one battle, and that was so later in the war. Yes, I agree with you. But early in the war, most of the Germans were using Panzer IIs. The Panzer II was not a spectacular tank. It was good enough. The main advantage was that the Germans had a lot of them, and they swarmed the French with them. German tanks only start to get really good with the Panzer III, which they did have in 39, just not a lot of them, and then the Panzer IV. Now, the Russian T-34 was a very effective tank, but again, like the Panzer IV and the later Tiger tanks, the Russians didn't have all that many of them early in the war. So, a lot of the tanks were better than they get credit for being in World War II. Like, you can ask Bira Light, the guy who was on here earlier, about the Sherman. The Sherman was a very good tank. They there was very little that could stand up one on one against something like a Tiger. Yeah. So the French had spectacular tanks from a military, like an arms standpoint at the start of the war. The issue wasn't the tanks; it was how they were being used. It all came down to tactics, and I don't know too much about the Czech tanks, but the Czechs had a similar strategy to the French, and it was very defensive and focused on digging in and fighting statically. That said, the Czechs kind of got sold out by the British um, in exchange for peace in our time. That infamous quote from Neville Chamberlain. It would have been interesting if the Germans had actually had to fight the Czechs, with considering the border defenses the Czechs had built up prior to World War II. But they never had to. Yeah, the acquiescing to the Germans did a lot more damage in the long run. And I mean, the main reason Poland got screwed was so there's a bit more nuance to it there. Um, the U.S. was the main faction fighting the Japanese because it was the only major Allied power with a significant Pacific coastline. But the Australians also had a major contribution to the Pacific War that often gets forgotten. And then in Europe, it was really it wouldn't. The Soviets were vital, yes, but without the French resistance, without the British army, without the U.S. army, I'm doubtful the Soviets could have fought their way all the way to Berlin. Part of the reason the Germans collapsed is they were effectively fighting on three fronts. So they had the Soviets in the east, the Allies invaded Italy in the south, and a lot of Germans went to Italy to try to fight that back because the Italians were not fighting very effectively. They weren't, but they were very effective once they got marshaled by a central authority. And then they were very useful in hampering the Germans and making them less effective. So, prior to the D-Day invasion, um, the French resistance blew up a hell of a lot of bridges and railroads that slowed the German response to the D-Day invasions. And it allowed the US and British to establish a firm beachhead in preparation of any German counterattacks, which would have arrived rather quickly had it not been for the resistance blowing bridges. But you're right, before they got marshaled by the Allies, they were not a particularly effective force. especially considering that they had no real love for each other either. Um, Most of the resistance in the South was based around a lot of Catholic communities there, but most of the resistance in the North were communists and socialists, and communists and Catholics do not like each other very much, at least in terms of the political. And then there was another guy whose contribution often gets forgotten, but Jean Moulin was a French lawyer who was parachuted into occupied France and managed to tie together the communications for both the northern and southern resistance. He was captured by the Germans and tortured for a month and didn't tell them fucking anything. Pretty badass guy, but also kind of gets forgotten. Also, yeah, the Germans discovered a lot of really interesting, powerful shit too late to actually make use of it. Like, the Sturmgewehr 44 would probably have been the greatest infantry weapon of the war had the Germans figured out how to do it earlier. But they didn't. So, when it was introduced, the Germans were already collapsing on both fronts. But if you look at units that were actually issued it, particularly on the Eastern Front, the STG 44s were incredibly effective in battle. They just didn't have enough of them that it really made a difference. The Germans never developed nuclear warheads, I will say that much. They were working on it, but they never got there. Thank God. And part of the reason is a lot of the Germans, a lot of the, a lot of German scientists who were ethnically or religiously Jewish left or were killed during the Holocaust, and a lot of them found their way into the U.S. and allies, where they, if they had the expertise, wound up on the Manhattan Program. Um, but if the Germans had developed nuclear warheads, it would have been devastating, considering how that the V2 rocket was relatively effective. Would have been effective enough for launching a warhead. You don't need to be that accurate when you're talking about nuclear payloads. You just got to get within a few miles of your intended target, and you're probably going to do a number on it. There's actually a few great documentaries out there about the Manhattan Project, one of the most interesting scientific efforts of the last century. That said, it's one that the Soviets had infiltrated from pretty much the very beginning, which is part of why they had a bomb so quickly after it. And it's also part of why the Korean War cooled down, is because we the Soviets were very close to developing a bomb. No, so the way those bombings worked out, there's a lot of context to the atomic bombings of Japan that gets ignored. So, when those decisions were made, The US and Allied High Military Command were just getting the casualty figures from D Day. They were just figuring out how devastating that was in terms of losses for the Allied forces. And the proposed invasion of Japan would have required two separate D Days. And they were expecting the casualties to exceed 1 million men just for the Allies. That wasn't considering the sheer number of Japanese civilians who would be killed, because what you have to remember about the Japanese government is it had propagandized to its people so much that they would have fought tooth and nail against American invaders, and the Americans didn't want to have the blood of that many civilians on their hands because the Japanese had it in place plans to fight with bamboo sticks if they had to. So, when Truman made the decision to drop the first atomic bomb, he was considering it came down to the brutal calculus of war. Do I wipe out this city of 200,000 to spare us a million losses? And he decided to do that. So, after the first bomb, the Japanese were asked to surrender, and they didn't. And that was when he dropped the Nagasaki bomb. So, was it necessary is one of the great ethical questions of World War II military history. Now, another part of the reason why I think Truman made the call to do it is because the Soviets were prepping for an invasion of Japan. And we wanted to prevent another Korea situation from arising where it gets split half and half. Because at that point, the Soviets had already invaded Northern Korea. And we all saw how that ended up. I'm saying it's a decision that I don't think I don't know if I would have been able to make the same call. But war is war, and yeah, that's a very good point, Aka. War is war, and considering that World War II was total war, the definition of total war, I think Truman looked at it and thought that if the Japanese had the opportunity to do the same to the U.S., they would have. And I also don't think he wanted to see what would have happened when American soldiers had to go into Japan and gun down civilians, because that's what an invasion of Japan would have looked like. It would have been brutal fighting in the mountains against civilians dead set on resisting you to their last breath. And we'd already seen how potent the Japanese were with booby traps. And I mean, yeah, nuclear bombs were expensive, but if you want to get into brutal casualties of war, the fire bombings of Tokyo were actually more destructive than Hiroshima or Nagasaki in terms of lives lost. And yeah, casualties from an invasion, both on the Allied side and on the Japanese side, would have been many times that the number of people who died from the atomic bombings, which in all was about 200,000 people. And I agree with you there, but that is what extreme ideologies do to you. The problem with all That is true, but it's the problem with all totalitarian ideologies, be they right-leaning or left-winging, is left-wing, or they reduce all people to numbers. There's no individual for collectivists. And it's like Stalin put it correctly. One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And the problem is that both fascists and communists look at it that way. It doesn't matter how many bodies it takes, we will get to utopia. That's the that's the totalitarian mindset. And I agree with you there, but at that point the cat was already out of the bag. We knew this the Soviets had a nuclear problem and a nuclear program. The Germans had a nuclear program that we stopped. The atom was going to be split one way or the other, and I think Truman. I honestly think it's good that it was done in World War II because I don't think we. So what happened there is wait, what's going? Okay, Regency's ending. Nuclear weapons were going to be coming one way or the other. I think Truman deploying them when only one country had them illustrated the sheer destructive capability of them when actually deployed in a practical situation. So, in the Cold War, that caused the major powers to kind of shy away from using them, which I think in the long run was a good thing. Because I don't think we would have wanted to see what would have happened if the US or the Soviets decided to test out their nuclear weapons on each other. Because if that had happened, none of us would be sitting here right now. So it was one of those situations where the technology was coming one way or the other, and Truman made the decision to get out ahead of it. Right, they are, but the issue with them is who's going to give them up first? And the answer is nobody. Now, in the past several years since the Cold War, both Russia and the U.S. have scaled down their nuclear arsenals considerably. Like if my high school geopolitics class serves me well, the U.S. has roughly 5,000 nuclear warheads, and the Russians have roughly 7,000, which is many times less than either of us had in during the Cold War. I think at the height of the Cold War, the U.S. had like 20,000 warheads, and the Soviets had a few more. And just to put it in perspective, even with the scaled down nuclear arsenals, it's still enough to end all life on this planet twice. And that's not counting the British, French, and Israeli, the British and French arsenals. I'm blanking. I think the Israelis have nukes. I think they do. I'm forgetting who are the other nuclear armed powers. This is going to bother me. States with nuclear weapons. Okay, Israel has them. France, the U.S., Britain, Russia, China are the main nuclear weapon states. So things were kind of scaling down. And yeah, unless somebody develops a nuclear countermeasure, they're not going away. Actually, it's one of the most fucking metal things I've ever heard in my entire life. Um, I I don't know if either anyone here has heard of the Russian dead man's hand idea. So I'm glad you're liking it. So the Russians have a submarine off the coast of off their Pacific coast, and when they want, they can put it in radio communication with Moscow. And if radio communication with Moscow is ever severed, that submarine automatically launches the entire Russian nuclear arsenal at pre-selected NATO targets. So it's sort of if you kill us, we'll kill you too. Even if you catch us completely by surprise. It's ultimate mutually assured destruction. Because even if you were to obliterate every major Russian city, the dead man's hand would still launch their entire arsenal. And that would come pretty damn close to ending all life on this planet. Not because of radiation, like most people think, because of the sheer amount of dust it would kick up. It would actually block out the sun and cause a global winter. So nuclear winter is a thing. It's not caused by radiation in the slightest, though. It's caused by nuclear weapons putting so much dust into the atmosphere. That's why warfare has changed so much. Major powers don't go to war anymore. Yeah, well, I mean, North Korea has them, but Iran wants them. That is a long debate with some rather spicy answers. I am pretty much an anti-war libertarian, so I don't think we ought to be there anyway. So there's a the argument for why we were in Iraq so long is largely oil, but the U.S. now has enough in the way of domestic oil reserves that we can sustain ourselves for a very long time. But what we still have in Iraq are military bases close to the Iranian border. And what's on the other side of Iran? Afghanistan. I don't think the US particularly gives a shit what goes on in Afghanistan. But it is, if you ever did go to war with Iran, Afghanistan would be a useful staging ground. Same story with Pakistan, same story with a lot of those countries in that region. They would all be very useful if you wanted to go to war with Iran. And what country is it that the US saber rattles with constantly? Iran. I have never heard of Heartland theory. Also, yeah, the U.S. created Saddam, and when he outlived his usefulness, we had another invasion to get rid of him. And the other awkward thing about those wars is the 9/11 attacks were not carried out by a state actor. So who do we go to war with? We toppled the Iranian or the Iraqi government, but the Iraqi government had fuck all to do with 9/11. I will definitely check that out, and we can probably talk about it next time. But it's the same story with Afghanistan. The Afghan government and the Taliban had little to nothing to do with 9/11. Right, and Iran isn't a match for the U.S., but I don't think we should go in and fight them. There's no point in it. Yeah, no, Syria is a total fucking shit show. We should never have gotten involved in that one either. Honestly, I am, from a military standpoint, I consider myself more or less an isolationist. Also, get out of here with that. Um, Turkey's army is pretty sizable. I would consider it a pretty major local power. And another issue with Iran is, I mean, consider what Afghanistan has turned into. You just have a bunch of guys hanging out in the mountains with Kalashnikovs who hate the who hate us and know the land better than we ever could hope to. You don't necessarily need to fight somebody on even ground if you know the land. Look at Vietnam. The U.S. The only way the U.S. could have won the Vietnam War is if we incinerated the entire jungle, and that wasn't going to happen. But we could never know the land as well as the people who grew up there. It's the same story in Afghanistan. You can't know a country like that. Also, you did. Middle Eastern geopolitics is always a spicy topic. And it is a difficult position because if the US stopped being the global policeman, you would see Russia or China step in, and I don't think anybody wants to see a Russian or Chinese led world. For all the US's faults, I still think it's a relatively well intentioned country. I do not think the Russia or China are as well intentioned as the US. Like the US generally is trying to do good in the world, from my perspective. Doesn't always work out that way. Yeah, but they're trying. The Russians or the Chinese are not so altruistic. I don't know. They were the main safeguard of. Also, yeah, that is a. Oh wow, look at what happened to the Ottomans. Um, yeah, no, it's Syria is a complete and utter shit show. That is what a modern civil war looks like, and it's war has completely changed. And these days, again, great powers don't go to war with each other anymore. Almost all wars these days are fought in proxy through. Also, yes, Iran and Turkey are part of why that shit show is still going on because both of them want influence in Syria. And it's the whole issue with wars in the Middle East is there's a religious element, there's an ethnic element, there's a political ideology element. It is a way more complicated region to study and figure out than pretty much any other place on the planet. Like there are so many people with their fingers in Syria right now. And that's what's keeping the civil war going. That's because of how wars are fought now. No one really wins. Also, yeah, there are so many elements to wars in the Middle East that you would need you need a PhD just to figure out who's fighting who and why. And I can guarantee you, no, very few of the people going to war in the Middle East are experts on the Middle East. Also, yeah, it's a land grab on Turkey's part. Iran's interest is surrounding Israel, and the Saudis are involved because they hate the Iranians. I believe you mean the Mountain Turks. That's one of the most laughable fucking things I've ever heard. One thing studying history teaches you is that the world has always been a fucked up place. It will never not be a fucked up place. It's honestly part of why I started this podcast. I think a lot of I think a lot of the problems in the world today are caused because people don't really understand why anything is happening. People don't understand the world or their place in it. They don't understand the past. And it leads to a lot of confusion, a lot of pointless violence. I honestly like the Swiss perspective, and the U.S. used to have a similar perspective, and then we decided to abandon Washington's advice about about foreign entanglements. But I started this podcast in an effort to do what little I can do to help people understand the world and their place in it a little bit better. Because if you understand why things are happening, yeah. So if you understand why things are happening, why the world is the way it is, and things make more sense to you, you can generally be just a more easygoing kind of person. Like, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Um, I do know that things are getting rather spicy in Australia in relation to the Chinese. But yeah, no, people. Some people learned the hard way that war is bad. Some people never quite learned that. But it's why I think everybody needs to study history. That actually, there's a good channel on this. Caspian Report. It's on YouTube. Check it out if you haven't. Very good takes on a lot of current geopolitical issues. But as somebody who has studied, who I have a bachelor's in history, and I've studied history personally my whole life, and all it's done is turn me into an aggressively anti-war, aggressively anti-intervention, libertarian type. Just let people be free, and they'll more often than not be responsible with it. Because it's one thing, especially about the modern era, people don't go to war, governments do. Governments high on their own sense of self-importance, who want to go wave their dicks around and prove that they're the biggest. But all it results in is a stack of bodies. And for what? Also, yeah, the media is something special. And by when I say people don't go to war, governments do, I mean it very much in the modern sense. Pretty much every war fought in the last century was fought between governments. I don't think I don't think full globalism is the answer either. I think what you see there is you're going to see more totalitarianism. I'm a very big believer that government should be kept as local as possible. Also, I do agree with you that media is a large part of the problem today, but I'm somebody who believes that government needs to be kept as local as possible because that keeps it very cl- government should be as close as possible to the people it's governing. That's why I very much like the U.S. federal system because I mean honestly, who do you think knows what say the people of I don't know Louisiana need most? The governor of Louisiana and the local government of Louisiana, or some dickheads in Washington? And I would say for pretty much any local issue, it's the state government. And honestly, a lot of the problems you're seeing in the US today is because the federal system is breaking down. There have been many power grabs on the part of the federal government in the last century, and we're seeing those birds come home to roost now. But part of the problem is the media is entirely driven by clicks. And I know that local corruption does become a problem when you have federalism, but I mean there are some places in the U.S. that are basically one-party rule. I mean, you can look at, say, California as an example where one party has held control for a couple decades now, and the other party has no chance of regaining that power. And there are some things we that the U.S. needs to do to mitigate that, like restricting gerrymandering. Honestly, Maryland's a prime example of this. The congressional district I live in is shaped like an S and stretches over three separate cities. Rather, one city and two smaller towns. Also, that is true. People get tribalistic, and they vote for their party. They vote for their team without particularly considering what that team actually stands for. It's a double-edged sword. Um, I think it allows a lot more to get done when one party is in full control, but it also leads to extreme flip-flopping from one end to the other. There's no perfect system, and any system can be corrupted by shitty people. And the main problem with a lot of democratic societies or republican societies is that um, power goes to the people who want it, and more often than not, only shitty people want the power. But it's getting kind of late, and I have work tomorrow, so I think I'm going to call it for the night. Thank you all for turning out for the stream. Always interesting conversation. I will see you guys next Friday, or well, this coming Friday, and keep an eye out for my next. Keep an eye out for my next episode, which will come out on. I'm shooting for Wednesday or Thursday. But thank you, and see you guys. This is Renegade Historian signing off.